My name is Jonad Kosova, and I will be presenting my dissertation for the MSc in Counseling for Bangor University. I thirst for you like a parched land, taken from the Bible, specifically Psalm 143:6. Psychodynamic Insights into the link between relationships and spirituality is my dissertation title. So a little bit about me before I tell you about the contents of today's presentation. I am an assimilative psychodynamic practitioner in training, hopefully soon to be qualified. And when it comes to research, I have authored 2 published papers, respectively on autism treatment research and psychological flexibility and its relation to depression. On a more personal note, spirituality is a very important aspect of my life. I don't describe myself as religious, though I do hold very strong spiritual convictions and beliefs. And the picture that you see on the right is my favorite painting by William Bouguereau as well. But without wasting too much time on why I love that painting and William Bouguereau as an artist, I will talk to you about the structure of today's presentation, which roughly follows the structure of a standard dissertation as well, which is the introduction. I'll be introducing you to both concepts, into the existing research and what the literature can tell us, and why I even went into this topic. Moving on to the methods, before which actually I will tell you about my research question and hypothesis. I'll explain more when we get there. But like I was saying, the methods, as in how we actually conducted this study, to the results. So what the data that we received was the discussion, which essentially is an interpretation of those results. And lastly, the references. Always gotta have your references. So before we get into the actual topic of this dissertation, it's important to define terms. So we'll start with spirituality. The British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy defines or includes in its definition of spirituality belief, faith, religion, and other ways, so it's quite broad, in which we experience deeper connection to and appreciation of self, other, environment, and or God. To that, I'll add nature, the universe, whatever divine or higher object or being or concept one might ascribe to. So it is often through these 3 main concepts, with referring to self, other, environment there, that themes such as hope, meaning, connectedness, belief systems, and expressions of spirituality, among others of course, can be articulated. Spirituality itself has been studied as a mediating factor, primarily in marital and life satisfaction, and has been found to have an important impact. However, extramarital relationships, such as your colleagues or your work relationships, your friends, or your family relationships, have been almost entirely exempt from research interest. Moving on to our other very important concept, which is interpersonal relationships. They're included as one of the main dimensions of overall health and well-being. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as social health in some literature. It even constitutes one of the 3 main approaches to individualized spiritual care, alongside self-discovery and eco-awareness. Now, we're assessing interpersonal relationships. Relationship satisfaction, which is what this paper is about in part, is one of, if not the most important major area in relationship research, though it's mostly being confined to a romantic and or marital context. Relationship satisfaction and the quality of our interpersonal life has been of interest to fields including sociology, psychology, communications, philosophy, and of course mental health / psychotherapy / counseling as well. So, why the 2 together? What do we know so far about them, and why are we trying to even find a connection between them? So we know that spirituality and relationship satisfaction both have been shown to have an effect on health. Researchers have attempted to tackle the question of whether the 2 are also interlinked in their own distinct ways. This has been limited in both ways, so in both spirituality, in which mostly religiosity has been considered, mainly the Christian religion, And relationships, it's mostly been, like it has been mentioned before, romantic relationships, mostly marriages, heteronormative ones, monogamous ones, so it's been quite limited in that regard as well. Research shows that there are specific processes, though, such as relying on religious teachings, nurturing spiritual observance, etc., and activities, such as prayer, that result from spiritual convictions and that lead to positive outcomes in interpersonal relationships. Again, through that very limited frame. Perhaps by bringing a more integrated approach, one that looks at spirituality relationally, rather than as a purely esoteric concept independent from the happenings in the outside world, that maybe we can shed some light into our growing understanding of why spirituality seems to impact relationship satisfaction. Before moving on to the research question and hypothesis, which I'm sure we're all very excited to hear, it's also worth asking why a psychodynamic approach? Why does the title specify Psychodynamic Insights? Well, a psychodynamic approach, besides being my preferred framework, like I explained in the beginning, it also takes a very special interest in relationships, which is seen through its many different schools of thought, mainly object relations, which states that we internalize important others, which it refers to as objects, in our early life by creating self-representations and object representations, which are tied together by a specific affect. Attachment theory, which has evolved from object relations, has also greatly contributed to our understanding of how we create, develop, and maintain relationships, as well as how they affect us. Now, how can we bring this into the discussion about spirituality and into the larger discussion of the possible relationship between these two concepts? So could this process of internalizing others, like object relations suggests, happen with the divine as well? So whether it is God, nature, the universe, whatever it is, could we display different attachment styles to these concepts? Can we be avoidantly attached to our concept of God? Can we be anxiously attached to our concept of the universe? And how does this affect our other relationships, if it does at all? Thank you there. We're not moving on to research question and hypothesis yet because we need to look at demographic attributes. Now, the lack of research in this particular topic means that there are no apparent differences in specific demographics when it comes to how their spirituality is correlated with their relationship satisfaction, because again, people haven't really looked at the link between the two in a more general context. However, there's plenty of research that suggests different levels of spirituality in different demographic groups. Hence why we also looked at age, sex, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ethnicity, to see if we could come to any findings regarding possible links between any of them and our covariables, which are, again, spirituality and relationship satisfaction. And on to the big part, the research question or questions and their respective hypotheses. So our first question is there a correlation, so is there a link between levels of spirituality and levels of relationship satisfaction? My hypothesis, so my informed assumption based on the literature, I think there is a relationship between these two covariables. Now we went a step further and made it a bit more directional, because we asked, are higher levels of spirituality correlated with higher levels of relationship satisfaction? And our hypothesis was that yes, higher levels of spirituality are linked with higher levels of relationship satisfaction. So let's have a look at how we actually went about conducting this study. Methods section will cover participants, the criteria for which was to be over 18 years old, really no other exclusion criteria other than being under 18. We had about 130 participants, and they were mainly recruited from social media like WhatsApp and through email. The design, which is a quantitative research design, it's a correlational study with its codependent variables, so there's no dependent or independent variables, and our control variables. The codependent ones are spirituality and relationships, which relationship satisfaction to be exact, which we talked about in the introduction, and the control variables are the demographic attributes. We use the spirituality scale by Delaney and the relationship satisfaction scale by Burns for our measures. And in terms of the procedure, it was done completely remotely. They were presented, so the participants, after following the link, they were presented with an information sheet and consent form. They went on to the survey if they agreed to it, which included the demographic questions and their 2 measures, and it was then followed by a debrief form. Quickly, before we move on to the discussion, let's look at what we did to analyze the data and get our results. We use a one-tailed Pearson's correlation for the unidirectional influence to assess the relationship between our codependent variables. It was revealed that there is actually a correlation or relationship between them, a weak positive one, as the values on screen suggest as well. With 103 participants, it was a statistically significant finding. So this suggests that higher levels of spirituality are associated with greater satisfaction in interpersonal relationships. No major trends were found in descriptive analysis, including demographic data. So let's actually move on to what the findings suggest regarding our demographic data. We'll skim through this a little bit since, spoiler alert, we didn't really find any statistically significant findings regarding demographic data and its correlation with our codependent variables. No major differences were found between men and women, which were the 2 dominant gender identifications in our study when it comes to their scores of and levels of spirituality and relationship satisfaction. The mean scores for all of these can be found on the screen. The same goes for sex. Now, females scored a bit higher on both relationship satisfaction and sexuality, but the scores really were not much different. No statistical tests revealed these differences to be significant. So sex and gender are neither a determining factor. Sex and either gender are a determining factor in either construct within this sample. Sort of the same goes for sexuality and age. Most of our participants identified as straight. Their scores really were not much different to the other groups, which had a significantly lower number of participants. It's notable, though, that these groups with a lower number of participants could be compared because the participants that identified as asexual actually reported the highest on both spirituality and relationship satisfaction, whereas gay/lesbian individuals scored the lowest in both. So they're both number 1 and the sort of bottom of the ranking, respectively. But not a lot of participants there, so nothing statistically significant. When it comes to age, most of our participants were 21 to 24, so university age. So we didn't have a lot of participants from varying ages, so it was a bit difficult to look at specific trends in regards to whether there's a decrease or an increase of spirituality or relationship satisfaction. However, what we can say is that age 24 is the highest level of spirituality, or has the highest level of spirituality than any other age with comparable levels of participants, and 21 shows the lowest. 35 to 44 seems like it's having the highest level of interpersonal relationship satisfaction, but they only had about 2 to 3 participants each. There seems to be a sporadic distribution of high scores amongst all ages, though it is notable that the higher the age, the more steady the scores of relationship satisfaction become. In other words, a lower range. As mentioned above, though, this cannot be conclusive due to a small number of participants for most ages. On to nationality and ethnicity. Most of our participants were either Indian nationals or British nationals. So those are the 2 groups that we compared. Our findings suggest that while cultural or national differences may contribute to varying expressions or values related to spirituality, they may have less influence on relationship satisfaction in this sample. So this supports the idea that spirituality, while it is culturally informed, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the discussion further, it may not necessarily impact all domains of well-being in the same way. Basically the same for ethnicity. Now, the differences that we found, although present, they're not substantial enough to infer a significant role of ethnicity in shaping our codependent variables. That said, the consistency in results across the two largest groups, which were Asian and white groups, suggests a level of cross-cultural similarity in the experience of relationship and spirituality and relationship quality within this sample. So when we're trying to decipher what our findings tell us, it's important to look back on the research question. Is there a relationship, and what is that relationship like? So is there a relationship between the two covariables, and do higher levels of spirituality correlate with higher levels of relationship satisfaction? So apparently, yes, the hypothesis was correct for both of them. The relationship was quite weak. It was a positive one, but it was quite weak in our case, which means that we would be dishonest to claim that our findings show that spirituality is majorly correlated with relationship satisfaction in this study. However, in continuing this discussion through a psychodynamic lens, a number of insights emerge that may shed light on the deeper, often unconscious dynamics involved in how individuals relate to both spiritual concepts and intimate partners. This is largely based on the comments, so the qualitative feedback left by some of the participants as well. So I mentioned attachment theory. The spiritual domain may serve as a continuation or even corrective of early relational experiences. So this could help explain why shared spirituality within a within a romantic relationship may enhance satisfaction, which is actually a lot of what the comments were saying. It provides a framework for emotional resonance and a mutual understanding that is anchored in internalized relational models, so how we experience each other. Consequently, the correlation we observe between spirituality and relationship satisfaction may reflect not only conscious beliefs or practices, but also deeply embedded attachment patterns that shape how individuals relate to both the sacred and to each other. From the object relations side, it's been proposed that an individual's image of God is not an abstract or spontaneous construction, but rather one that emerges from early relational experiences, specifically those involving primary caregivers. So in this framework, the sacred becomes a reflection of our foundational object relations, shaping the emotional tone, consistency, and attachment patterns established in early life. This perspective offers a useful lens through which to interpret our findings, particularly the connection between spirituality and relationship satisfaction. Now moving on to limitations, of which there weren't really any, neither a number nor a population, seeing as most research work out there actually recruits from university students, much like ours. However, we do have recommendations for future research, plenty of ideas. We believe that future research can take what our findings have to offer and expand on them further, primarily through qualitative means. Through this, they can look at specific aspects of an individual's spiritual beliefs that affect the interpersonal sphere, measure other variables that play into relationship satisfaction, while also being able to analyze particular themes in their interviewing process. Expanding the sample size and diversifying the participants is also probably a good idea, as it would provide more robust data for interpreting the roles that these demographic attributes play in our covariables. It's looked at mainly from a psychodynamic angle, and maybe we'd like to look at defense mechanisms as constructs that play into the relationship between the covariables. It's also a really good idea to look at attachment styles and their relevance in the topic of spirituality and relationships as a dyad. These are generally unrefined assumptions, but future research can take them, expand them further, and may be able to shed some light into this link so that we realize, as Margaleta puts it, quite beautifully in my opinion, the seeming differences in spiritual experience and internal psychological development are just that, seeming. What are the implications, the take-home messages? Let's look at practice. Spirituality and religion are important concepts when it comes to being process-oriented. Large resistance to or high investment in the two may reveal the need to include them more actively in the work. All should be done within the proper ethical framework with the individual's well-being and best interest in mind. When it comes to research, it's important to continue the efforts in being more inclusive in regards to different demographics, making sure to pay attention to less represented groups. More qualitative studies that allow for more expansive views into people's relationship with their spirituality and religion may provide better insight into this correlation. And finally, the references. Thank you for listening through this presentation, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day/night.